The Vatican doesn't archive documents. They bury them. In 1965, they locked an Ohio widow's diary in a lead safe because her flawless Latin was a countdown. Those crime scene Polaroids proved the church wasn't hiding a demon. They were hiding what haunted it. Subscribe to the channel and uncover exactly what they erased.
November 1965 brought a bitter, biting cold to the deep rural stretches of Perry County, Ohio. The kind of isolated darkness out there is absolute, swallowing headlights and silencing even the wind. It was on one of these freezing nights that the local sheriff's department received a standard dispatch. A distant neighbor had reported a possible trespasser at an old off-grid farmhouse miles from the main highway. The officers dispatched that night expected a routine check on a vagrant looking for shelter. The property belonged to Martha Gable, an 88-year-old widow who lived completely alone and off the grid. Driving up to her land took the deputies nearly 40 minutes over unpaved, deeply rutted dirt roads. They lost radio contact with dispatch halfway up the ridge, isolated entirely in the dense Appalachian foothills. There were no streetlights, no neighboring porches, and absolutely no signs of life approaching the property line. It was just the crunch of their tires on gravel and the overwhelming blackness of the Ohio woods. When the cruiser finally rolled to a stop, the farmhouse stood out against the night sky like a shadow. There was no electricity wired to the property, meaning the house was completely devoid of artificial light. The deputies stepped out into the freezing air, their heavy boots crunching loudly on the frosted grass. They clicked their heavy metal flashlights on, the beams struggling to cut through the thick, settling fog. Everything about the scene screamed abandonment, but the neighbor had been adamant about seeing movement inside. Approaching the wooden porch, the officers noticed the front door was already hanging slightly off its latch. They drew their service revolvers, moving with the quiet caution of men expecting a desperate burglar. The wooden floorboards groaned under their weight as they carefully pushed the front door wide open. Inside, the temperature felt somehow colder than the freezing winds blowing through the trees outside. They called out to announce themselves, but the only response was a hollow, heavy silence echoing back. The beams of their flashlights swept across the modest living room, revealing faded wallpaper and antique furniture. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, and no overturned chairs in the entryway. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone, old paper, and something deeply metallic, almost like copper. They moved tactically through the hallway, checking the empty corners and the vacant, freezing bedrooms. It was when they reached the small, cramped kitchen at the back of the house that they found her. Martha Gable was not hiding in a closet, nor was she bound and gagged by an intruder. She was sitting perfectly upright at a small wooden dining table, completely enveloped in the pitch dark. An old kerosene lantern sat right next to her, completely full but deliberately left unlit. The officers slowly lowered their weapons, confused by the eerie stillness of the elderly woman before them. They asked if she was hurt, but she didn't even flinch at the sound of their loud, booming voices. Instead of speaking, the only sound coming from her corner of the room was a frantic, rhythmic scratching. The deputies took a cautious step forward, angling their flashlights down to see her hands moving furiously. She was clutching a cheap ballpoint pen, driving it into the pages of a spiral-bound notebook. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring straight ahead into the darkness rather than looking at the paper. The scratching sound was relentless, a fast and unbroken rhythm that felt deeply unnatural for someone her age. As they moved closer, the officers realized this wasn't the only notebook on the small kitchen table. Dozens of similar notebooks were stacked haphazardly around her, every single one filled edge to edge with ink. The deputies gently tried to take the pen from her hand, but her grip was tight as iron. She didn't acknowledge their presence, breathing in a slow, measured cadence while her hand violently swept across the page. It was as if her mind was entirely gone, but her body was executing a highly complex task. One of the officers picked up a completed notebook from the pile and shined his light directly onto the pages. He fully expected to see the chaotic scribbles of dementia or a desperate plea for help. Instead, the pages were covered in perfectly aligned, meticulously structured paragraphs of dense, looping handwriting. There were no crossed-out words, no mistakes, and the margins were respected with absolute mathematical precision. It was a beautiful script, completely devoid of the shaky hesitation you would expect from an 88-year-old hand. The deputy stared at the words, trying to make sense of the strange vocabulary filling the worn paper. It wasn't English, nor was it the random, meaningless gibberish associated with a psychological break. It was Latin, flawless, archaic ecclesiastical Latin, written with terrifying speed and grammatical perfection. Martha Gable had lived her entire life in rural Ohio, dropping out of school in the 8th grade. Yet here she was in the dark, single-handedly transcribing what experts would later identify as forbidden canonical texts. The deputies, entirely unsure of how to proceed, decided to hold their position and radio for medical backup. Due to the extreme remoteness of the property, the nearest psychiatric transport vehicle wouldn't arrive until daylight. To document the bizarre situation, one deputy retrieved a standard-issue reel-to-reel tape recorder from the trunk of their cruiser. They placed the heavy microphone on the kitchen table, hoping to capture any verbal response from the unresponsive widow. That spinning magnetic tape would soon become the focal point of the most heavily classified audio file in modern history. Around 2 in the morning, the relentless, frantic scratching of Martha's pen suddenly and completely stopped. The audio logs capture a heavy, suffocating silence, lasting exactly 4 minutes before a low, rhythmic whispering began. The voice captured on the tape did not belong to the frail, elderly woman sitting motionless in the wooden chair. It was a resonant, deeply guttural baritone that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the cramped kitchen. The deputies documented in their initial logs that the sound wasn't coming from her mouth, but seemed to project from the shadows themselves. As the unnatural voice continued to speak in rapid, flowing Latin, the physical environment of the farmhouse began to rapidly deteriorate. The official police timeline notes a sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature that violently cracked the glass of the unlit kerosene lantern. Frost began to spiderweb across the interior walls, creeping over the faded floral wallpaper in thick, jagged, unnatural patterns. The deputies reported a heavy, oppressive atmospheric pressure that made it incredibly difficult for them to draw a full breath. Their compasses, standard gear for rural patrols in the deep woods, began to spin wildly, indicating a massive electromagnetic anomaly. By dawn, the situation had escalated beyond anything standard law enforcement protocols could ever train a man to handle. The deputies had barricaded themselves in the hallway, unable to approach the kitchen due to an invisible, heavy physical resistance. Desperate, they radioed a nearby parish instead of the precinct, begging for someone who understood the archaic language being spoken. Father Michael, a local rural priest with absolutely no formal training in spiritual warfare, arrived just before noon. He stepped into the freezing farmhouse expecting to bless a dying woman, but immediately recognized the distinct, burning scent of sulfur. Father Michael's personal journal, later leaked to the public by an anonymous Vatican archivist, detailed his first horrific moments inside. He wrote that the entity occupying Martha did not acknowledge the police, but it immediately recognized his clerical collar. The deep guttural voice ceased its Latin recitations and began speaking to the priest in perfect colloquial, mocking English. It recited specific, deeply buried sins from Father Michael's childhood, things he had never confessed to another living soul. This calculated psychological assault confirmed to the terrified priest that this was not a medical crisis, but a genuine demonic occupation. Standard Catholic protocol strictly dictates that an exorcism requires weeks of psychological evaluation and direct written authorization from the local bishop. Father Michael knew that waiting for the diocese to process the bureaucratic paperwork would mean the agonizing death of Martha Gable. The physical toll on the 88-year-old's body was becoming violently apparent as her skin bruised and her eyes rolled backward. Knowing it would likely cost him his priesthood and his reputation, he made the terrifying decision to perform an unsanctioned major exorcism. He instructed the terrified deputies to lock the heavy wooden doors, keep the tape rolling, and not intervene under any circumstances. The continuous audio recording of the next 48 hours is considered the holy grail of anomalous religious phenomena. Father Michael began reciting the Ritual Romanum, his voice visibly shaking, but growing steadily louder over the chaotic background noise. Almost immediately, the tapes capture the sickening sound of heavy wooden furniture splintering and slamming violently against the ceiling. Martha's frail body was allegedly held down by an invisible force, her limbs contorting into anatomically impossible broken angles. The deputies, trained to handle violent armed criminals, could only huddle in the doorway and pray for their own survival. The entity did not surrender easily, fighting the sacred rites with a terrifying display of localized, destructive kinetic energy. The original crime scene Polaroids taken the following day show deep, parallel gouges in the hardwood floor, as if clawed by heavy machinery. According to the dispatch logs, every time Father Michael invoked the Holy Trinity, a deafening, thunderous crash echoed from the empty attic. The tape reveals the entity mocking the priest's faith, promising that the Vatican itself would eventually abandon and erase him. It claimed to be something much older than the rural dirt they stood on, something that predated human language altogether. On the third night of the ordeal, the recording captures a moment of absolute, terrifying silence that lasted for 12 agonizing seconds. Then, a frequency so high and piercing that it shattered the remaining kitchen windows bleeds entirely into the audio track. Both deputies are clearly heard screaming in genuine pain, covering their ears as the magnetic tape struggles to process the acoustic overload. Father Michael's voice cuts through the chaos one final time, shouting the concluding, commanding prayers of the Roman Rite. Following a massive, concussive thud that shook the entire stone foundation of the house, the farmhouse fell completely, mercifully silent. When the dust finally settled, Martha Gable was lying unconscious on the ruined kitchen floor, breathing softly and looking remarkably peaceful. Father Michael was slumped against the peeling wallpaper, physically broken and clutching his wooden rosary with bleeding, trembling fingers. The deputies immediately moved to secure the elderly woman, profoundly relieved that the 3-day nightmare had finally come to an end. They believed they had survived the absolute worst, completely unaware that the true terror of this case was only just beginning. The local authorities had no idea that Rome had been listening the entire time, and the institutional cover-up was already in motion. The morning sun had barely crested the Appalachian tree line when the sound of heavy engines violently broke the quiet silence. Before local medical teams could even be dispatched, a fleet of unmarked black sedans arrived at the isolated rural property. Men in immaculate dark suits stepped out onto the frozen Ohio dirt, moving with a terrifying, highly coordinated military precision. They completely bypassed the exhausted deputies, treating the shattered farmhouse not as a local crime scene, but as a compromised containment zone. These unknown agents did not identify themselves as federal authorities, nor did they wear any standard law enforcement badges or insignia. Among them were individuals wearing clerical collars, moving with a silent, unquestioned authority over the heavily armed men in suits. They immediately locked down the entire perimeter, unspooling thick wire fencing across the only dirt road leading back to civilization. The local deputies were swiftly disarmed and pushed out into the freezing cold without a single explanation or standard debriefing. The operatives showed absolutely zero interest in providing basic medical attention to the unconscious elderly woman lying on the kitchen floor. Instead, their primary target was the physical evidence the local police had diligently gathered over the agonizing 3-day ordeal. They seized the reel-to-reel tape recorder, carefully securing the magnetic audio tapes inside heavily padded, lead-lined metallic briefcases. The original Polaroid photographs, still smelling sharply of developing chemicals, were snatched directly from the hands of the terrified local officers. Another team of specialists, wearing white archival gloves, systematically descended upon the dozens of ink-filled notebooks scattered around the room. They catalogued each book with cold efficiency, sliding the archaic Latin texts into secure, waterproof lockboxes destined directly for Rome. They scraped the splintered wood and collected the shattered glass, ensuring not a single physical trace of the anomaly remained behind. It was a forensic scrubbing operation so incredibly thorough, it defied any standard operating procedure known to domestic law enforcement. Father Michael was not treated as a heroic savior who had just rescued an innocent woman from a horrific spiritual entity. 2 men roughly escorted the exhausted, bleeding priest into the back of a waiting vehicle, completely refusing to let him speak. He was immediately stripped of his parish credentials and his local diocese was instructed to publicly state he suffered a nervous breakdown. He was relocated to an undisclosed monastic facility in Europe, entirely silenced and strictly forbidden from ever contacting his Ohio congregation again. The surviving local deputies were physically separated, placed into windowless vehicles, and subjected to hours of hostile interrogation by federal suits. They were explicitly told that the events of the past 3 days were a localized, chemically induced mass hallucination caused by gas. Threatening them with severe federal charges and the destruction of their families, the agents forced them to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements. They were ordered to return to their precinct and pretend that the midnight dispatch call to Martha's property had never happened. As for Martha Gable, the 88-year-old widow was loaded into a heavily tinted, privately contracted medical transport vehicle under heavy guard. She was never taken to any regional hospital, and absolutely no public medical records in the state of Ohio reflect her admission. Her property deed was quietly transferred to a blind shell corporation weeks later, and the farmhouse was ultimately burned completely to the ground. Martha simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the law, becoming a ghost erased by a terrifyingly efficient institutional machine. The official cover-up extended deep into the administrative archives of the Perry County Sheriff's Precinct later that very same week. When the dispatch operator went to file the weekly radio logs, she discovered that the specific pages had been violently torn out. The carbon copies of the original trespassing report were missing from the locked filing cabinets, leaving a massive, unexplained gap in the records. The entire incident was surgically amputated from local history, buried under decades of bureaucratic silence and deliberate, highly organized intimidation. However, the Vatican investigators made one single, highly critical mistake during their aggressive sweep of the frozen Ohio farmhouse crime scene. Before the black sedans had arrived, a terrified deputy managed to duplicate a small segment of the audio onto a secondary reel. He also hid 3 original Polaroids of the deeply gouged floorboards inside the heavy leather lining of his winter patrol boots. These fragmented pieces of evidence remained locked in a basement safe for nearly 6 decades, waiting for the exact right moment to surface. We now possess the translated fragments of the only notebook page that managed to slip past the church's ironclad archival purge. Linguists who analyzed the text confirmed it wasn't just a random collection of archaic prayers or dark, meaningless demonic blasphemy. The flawless Latin described a highly specific geographic gateway hidden deep within the rural Appalachian mountains, detailing an entity preparing to wake. It was an architectural blueprint of something ancient, explaining exactly why the Vatican decided the world must never know the terrifying truth. The story of Martha Gable remains one of the most aggressively buried ecclesiastical mysteries of the 20th century, living entirely in the shadows of classified Vatican vaults. We are left with only the fragmented remnants of that freezing November night, the terrifying acoustic distortion of a duplicated magnetic tape, 3 faded Polaroids of impossible physical destruction, and the chilling implications of a forgotten architectural blueprint. The church clearly determined that whatever occupied an 88-year-old widow in the isolated darkness of rural Ohio was far too dangerous for the general public to ever comprehend. They systematically erased a priest, silenced local law enforcement, and wiped a frail woman from existence just to keep that Appalachian gateway completely shut. You have seen the leaked forensic evidence, heard the suppressed dispatch logs, and reviewed the timeline. But the final judgment of what truly happened in that farmhouse rests entirely with you. If you want to dig deeper into this investigation, I need you to drop your theories in the comments section below and tell me exactly what you think the Vatican is still hiding. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications, because our team is actively translating the rest of the recovered Latin fragments for our next major case file. The truth is rarely found in the official, sanitized police reports, but it always leaves a dark trail for those who know exactly where to look. Share this video with anyone who questions the official narrative and help us keep the pressure on these forgotten, heavily redacted historical anomalies. Until our next classified file is finally opened, stay vigilant, question the institutions, and never trust the dead silence of the absolute middle of nowhere.